The Cromford and High Peak was no ordinary railway. It opened in 1830 at the dawn of the railway age as a means of linking two canal systems. 33 miles in length, the line ran between Cromford and Whaley Bridge across the high plateau of the Derbyshire Peak District, a route surveyed by Josias Jessup, son of the pioneering canal engineer William Jessup. Initially operating in isolation, it wasn't until the 1850s that it became integrated into the developing national railway network. It remained an important freight line, generating its own traffic and mainly carrying limestone, serving many works and quarries until its closure in 1967. Despite its mainline links, the Cromford and High Peak never lost its identity, and even today this very individual railway lives on in the memories of old railwaymen and the work of a dedicated band of enthusiasts. The development of the trackbed as an amenity route through the Peak National Park, the preservation of the original engineering workshops at Cromford, and the steam winding engine at Middleton Top should ensure that the line is never entirely forgotten.
Well, in order to understand what the engine does, it's as well to have a brief idea of the railway. Now, it's one of the earliest railways to be built in the country, but it was part of the canal transport system. It linked the Cromford Canal, which was part of the Trent Valley waterway system, with the Peak Forest Canal, which went down to the Mersey in Manchester and through. So it was quite an important link in its way. And it was built very like a canal. It was built in long, level sections, which made it easy for the horses to pull the wagons, because there were no locomotives in its first years. But where a canal would have had a flight of locks, this railway had inclined planes. And there were 9 such inclines, quite steep, 1 in 7s, 1 in 8s, 1 in 9 inclines, 9 in all, and each one had a winding engine almost identical to this one at the summit. So this is now the sole survivor of the 9 winding engines.
Sam Buckley was a legendary driver on the Cromford and High Peak, retiring only days before the closure of the line after completing almost 48 years of service. Jeff Buckley, one of his 4 sons, is very proud of his family's close associations with the line.
I think the most peculiar thing to the Cromford and High Peak that made its uniqueness was the fact that it was a railway within a railway. And I say that, it always remained Cromford and High Peak, whether it was within the LNW or BR. And in addition to that, it had its own railway community inside. When one thinks of the rest of the main line, drivers doing hundreds of miles a day, and these men would remain within that community and within the same people for 50 years. This made the Cromford and High Peak the Cromford and High Peak and kept its name and values together.
The line's tight curves and the inclines for ascending and descending isolated the Cromford and High Peak from the rest of the railway network. John Holroyd, who made this intricate model, was captivated by the inclines at an early age.
I started my days being quarried in Wirksworth, and it was during those early years of my life, probably in my pram, that I like to think I was first acquainted with the Cromford and High Peak Railway. Every enthusiast has his or her favourite railway, but it was the squeal of the wagons heard from my house at Bowl Hill near Wirksworth that really fired my enthusiasm and determined me to model the Cromford and High Peak as opposed to anything else. My model simply takes in Cromford, the incline and sheep pasture, with at the furthest end just a typical quarry rather than a specific one.
Another enthusiast, Alan Rimmer, intrigued by glimpses of the sheep pasture incline from the local bus, in his youth, only started to appreciate the High Peak's individual character when he began to work on the railway at Derby in the locomotive works in the LMS days. Since then, he has dedicated himself to researching the history of the line and to keeping alive the memory of the Cromford and High Peak. He's written a highly successful book, and in this video, Alan takes us on a fascinating journey along the route of the line. The first section of the route that Alan covers is from the canal basin at Whaley Bridge to Shoalcross Incline. The line left the basin, soon passing over the River Goyt, with sidings either side of the river serving the Calico Printers Association and the Goyt Mills. In a short distance, the track climbed the Whaley Bridge incline, carrying forward along the hillside through the upper part of the town to pass under the later constructed line linking Whaley Bridge to Buxton. Still running close by houses and rows of terrace cottages, the line reached Horwich End, passing through a cutting and under a bridge that once carried the A6 into Whaley Bridge, soon to arrive at Shallcross Yard.
The Peak Forest Canal reached Whaley Bridge in 1800. The High Peak Railway was intended to link this canal and the Cromford Canal to form a commercial link between the manufacturing areas in Lancashire and Cheshire and the coalfields of Nottinghamshire and Derbyshire. The warehouse here was made over the basin at the end of the canal, and at either side there were tracks leading into the warehouse so that the trucks and wagons were alongside the narrowboats under cover for transfer of goods from one to the other. This bridge, which crosses the River Goyt, is the beginning of the journey south to Cromford. The wharves are behind me at the moment, and just a little further the other side of the bridge is the first incline, the Whaley Bridge incline. There are still relics of the railway on this bridge, inasmuch as we still have the rails in position.
Although the Cromford and High Peak was originally conceived as a goods-carrying line, it did, in the early days, carry some passengers. The account of a 19th century traveller gives a fascinating glimpse of what the journey was like.
I travelled the whole length of the line almost 20 years ago. In 80. That's before they closed the northern section in 92. As an unofficial passenger, of course. It was quite a journey. I am at Whaley Bridge this July morning, and before half the world has breakfasted, the through-up train to Cromford is off and away. Due out at 10 minutes past 7 o'clock, we are timed to arrive at the Cromford terminus at 12:15. 5 hours. What progress we've made. Nowadays, you could be doing business in London in that time.
Here we are at the top of the Whaley Bridge incline. This was the first of 9 inclines on the line. In total, from Whaley Bridge, we climbed from an elevation of 517 feet above sea level through 4 inclined planes, Whaley Bridge, Shallcross, Bunsell number 1 and Bunsell number 2, to reach the upper levels of the railway, which were around about 1,260 feet above sea level. On the inclines there were 2 tracks, one for wagons coming up the hill and one for wagons going down the hill. This was a relatively short incline, 180 yards long, and it was relatively shallow as far as gradient at 1 in 13.5. It actually continued in use until 1952, and right from its early days it always had chains as the hauling mechanism, whereas the other inclines also started with chains but later went on to wire ropes.
The incline was initially worked by balancing ascending and descending loads, but if no balancing load was available, horses were used. In 1838, a steam winding engine was installed. By 1862, it was out of use, and working reverted back to counterbalancing and horse operation. Around 1890, a horse capstan was introduced at the top of the incline.
Now the horse simply walked round and round and round in a big circle, driving a underground pulley round which the chains passed, the chains running down between tracks on each side and going round underneath again at the bottom round another pulley.
In 1857, Whaley Bridge was brought into the developing North West Railway network when the tracks of the Stockport, Disley and Whaley Bridge Railway reached the village. Subsequently, a connection was opened linking the branch to the Cromford and High Peak. By 1863, the Stockport, Disley and Whaley Bridge Railway had been extended through to Buxton. In the same year, the Midland Railway, in its drive towards Manchester, extended its line from Roseley to Buxton. The Midland, finding its route beyond Buxton blocked by the Stockport, Disley and Whaley Bridge, constructed a link from Blackwell Mill to New Mills, giving access to Manchester by 1867. This development effectively ended the Cromford and High Peak's role as a through route between the coalfields of the East Midlands and the manufacturing areas of the North West.
Ahead of me, along the embankment, is the route of the Stockport, Disley and Whaley Bridge Railway, which of course still runs through to Buxton today. To my left, in this direction, was a connection onto that line, which then ran through to Shallcross Yard. Behind the group of trees over there was the bridge under the Stockport, Disley and Whaley Bridge line, which gave access into Whaley Bridge itself and down to the wharves by going down the incline.
In 1866, the Stockport, Disley and Whaley Bridge Railway and its Buxton extension were transferred to the ownership of the London and North Western Railway, who, by 1877, had amalgamated with the Cromford and High Peak. By 1892, the London and North Western, as part of its drive south, had built a branch from Buxton to connect up with the High Peak at Dowlow. This provided an alternative route to Whaley Bridge, which did not include the time-consuming inclines. However, the incline at Whaley Bridge remained an important link from the main line to the mills located along the canal basin until its final closure in 1952.
It was a big achievement in them days, really, wasn't it, really? Just to take 2 coal wagons down full and 2 empty ones up to the top of the plane and then back to the main line to go back to the pit to be refilled with coal again and back again.
A train used to come into Whaley Bridge and then they shunted the wagons into Shallcross sidings. As each one was named, you know, where to go, CPA or Goit Mill, they used to unhook these. The
steam locomotive used to push them down, shunt them down as fast as they could, and then they used to go under the railway mainline bridge, and so Mr. Lee could get all of them with the 2 horses, 2 full wagons with the horses, and take them to the top of the plane. The steam engine couldn't get this far down because of the bridge. There was a height limit on the bridge, so it stayed up at the Shallcross end, and then that's why Mr. Lee came in with his horses to fetch them down from the main line. I used to live here in this house in the middle here, and when the wagons come, we used to come and run and watch them go up and down the incline. 2 full wagons down, 2 empty ones up. 2 lines went down, then it went into a single line at the bottom, and the 2 big cart horses used to go down the plane to the bottom, and then they took the wagons from the coal wagons from the bottom then, one into the Goit Mill yard to the boil house, and one across the bridge towards the CPA mill yard. And then when we used to pull the wagons from the top of the incline back up to the sidings at Shallcross, we used to ride on the wagons, hang on the buffers, and Mr. Lee used to chase us off.
At first they had 3 horses and there was 2 men, my father and David Jodrell. They were busy then at the CPA and the Goit Mill and Meverill and Bockney. They also had lime coming from Buxton and down the line, and it went to a lime shed, and there was a tippler there where they dropped the sides and it fell into the boat, or they shoveled it in, whatever they had to do afterwards, you see.
Well, we're just approaching Shallcross Yard, which is through the bridge here. and beyond Shellcross Yard itself was Shellcross Incline. We're in the throat of Shellcross Yard here. We have a stone plaque commemorating the High Peak line, which also incorporates one of the original fish-bellied cast iron rails with which the line was first laid. Beyond me, behind me over here, was the yard itself, and that at the far end gave access onto Shellcross Incline, which took the line up the next escarpment towards Fernley on the way south up the Goyt Valley.
The sidings at Shallcross were once a hive of activity.
This is the original wall to the gasworks, where the coal wagons used to pull up at the side and empty the coal into the retort house. And over there, where them trees are, there used to be the gas hometers. And that used to be the pump house to the gas meters to pump gas all the way around the village. Further back, where the line divided into 6 sections, there was a corn store and another bleach works.
One leaves Whaley Bridge with its factories, colliery gins and slag heaps without regret. The first mile or so is in the Guards Break, and it is up the Shallcross gradient. Presently, we are amongst the bold features of the Derbyshire moorland hills.
From the top of Shallcross Incline, the line contoured up the side of the Goyt Valley before ascending the 2 Bunsell inclines to reach the summit and Wild Moor, across which it snaked before reaching the high ground at the head of the valley to enter Burbage Tunnel. We rejoin Alan alongside Fernley Reservoir.
Looking down the Goyt Valley, we can see where the track ran along on a shelf all the way along from the top of Shallcross Incline. Shallcross Incline had brought us up at a gradient of 1 in 10 1/4 over a distance of 817 yards to this level, and from here we go a little further along this way to the bottom of the Bunsell Incline.
Fernley Reservoir was constructed in the 1930s. 30 years later, in the 1960s, the building of the Irwood Reservoir commenced.
A locomotive meets us at the summit of the incline, and working tender first is taking on our train of some 20 wagons, a cargo which is a curious horlopoddria of grains, barrels of beer, bags of beans, sewing machines, flour, cans of paint, boxes of tea, and agricultural implements.
The lower incline rose on a gradient of 1 in 7 over a distance of 450 yards. The second, a little less steeply, at 1 in 7½ over 660 yards. By 1857, they'd been combined to save an estimated £600 a year. Some distance up the bank, at a point where the road bends, the intermediate winding engine house was located. Close by is the monument erected by the Stevenson Locomotive Society.
This plaque records the fact that in 1967 a road was built on the Bunsell Incline to bring material for the construction of the dam for the Irwood Reservoir.
From the top of the incline, which raised the line 457 feet in around a quarter of a mile, the view is superb.
Where I'm standing at the moment is the site of the engine house for the upper of the 2 Bunsell inclines. The engines on the Bunsell incline were of the same pattern as the rest of the ones throughout the line, built by the Butterley Company. They were 2-cylinder condensing beam engines of 20 horsepower and had cylinders of 25-inch bore by 5-foot stroke. This brings the line to the summit level. From here on until we get to Herdlow on the original layout of the line. The track is virtually level all the way.
Alongside the track, some 50 yards from the top of the incline, Alan paused beside a tranquil pool.
Behind me is the reservoir, which would have been the water supply for the stationary engine at Bunsell Top. Over there is the embankment along which the track ran, and it curves round through the cutting and then follows along across Wildmoor to Burbage Tunnel.
We seem to be moving along the top of the world. The journey is a scamper across savage and solitary moors. I am learning to balance myself on another quivering floorboard. To one accustomed to the swift, motionless motion of a Pullman Palace car or a Midland bogie carriage, the jerking, jolting, jig dancing of the engine of the High Peak Railway is an experience to remember.
A modification to the alignment ironed out one of the sharp curves. A short distance from Burbage Tunnel, Alan spotted something of considerable interest.
When the line was first built in the 1830s, it was laid with cast iron fish-bellied rails on stone sleeper blocks, and this is one of those stone sleeper blocks we've found this morning. You can see the indentation here where the foot of the rail rested on the block. There's a hole in the centre which was plugged with a hardwood plug or possibly lead, into which a spike was driven to secure the rail to the block.
In the railway workshops at Cromford Wharf, built in the 1820s, rail and block can be seen in their original position above the inspection pit.
The fish-bellied rails were constructed to join together using a mortise and tenon joint. The rail had a foot on one end and a tenon joint on the other. The tenon was put into the mortise, a pin put through there, a pin went down through the foot of the rail into the stone sleeper block, and that's the only thing that held the rail together along this plane.
Breakages of the wrought iron rails started to be a problem as early as 1833, when locomotives began to displace horses as a motive power between the inclines. It wasn't until 1843 that sections of track were replaced by rails of wrought iron as funds permitted. On the next part of the journey, Alan takes us through Burbage Tunnel, the longest on the route south, and then along the track bed as far as Ladmanlow, completing the journey over the section of the Cromford and High Peak that was abandoned when the more easily graded route down from the plateau became available in 1892.
The train is the only moving thing in sight, save when a wild goose or a curlew rises with a sharp cry. Then a sudden scream from the engine takes the startled air, and darkness shrouds the speeding train. "Burbage Tunnel!" yells the stoker in my ear, as he stands like a salamander in a white, dazzling circle of heat.
We're standing at the north portal of Burbage Tunnel. We're at the summit level of the line here, just below 1,300 feet, and that level has been maintained from the top of Bunsell Incline. When the track reached this point, there was a large hill in the way, and obviously the engineers decided that it wasn't worth building inclines up and down, and the only alternative was to bore a tunnel. The tunnel itself was 580 yards long at that time. What's left here is probably now about 578 yards long, unless there's any fallen down at the far end, because this point here is where the original portal of the tunnel was.
Within, 1,000 echoes fight with each other. The walls fly past like a rushing river. There is a furious whirlwind of tumult and a damp chill. In the distance, however, there is hope. A glimpse of light grows larger until, with a wild shriek from the snorting engine, we emerge from the darkness and damp into the glad blue light. and freedom again. Burbage Tunnel. The only one of any importance on the High Peak Railway, and dirty and wet enough for them all.
Here at the south portal of Burbage Tunnel, trains emerged onto the limestone plateau across which they ran towards Cromford. In the 1950s, this tunnel wasn't blocked as it is today, and it was possible to walk through it. I walked through it on one occasion using a powerful torch, and even then it took me about 12 to 15 minutes to get from one end to the other. Down in the hollow is the spa town of Buxton. The High Peak line came out of Burbage Tunnel over there, about 1.5 miles away, and then came round and under the bridge, which carried the old Macclesfield Road over it, up onto the moors, and then in the valley below that road was Goyt's Colliery, which provided traffic onto the line. Goyt's Colliery closed in 1902. In 1892, when the alternative through route to Whaley Bridge came into use, cutting out the 3 inclined planes in the Goyt Valley, then the old line terminated across here, just short of the bridge.
This is Ladmanlow, ventures the driver, shutting off the steam. The information anticipates my query, for there are no name boards on any of the stations to indicate your whereabouts. The stations are indeed but sheds, and they sometimes seem to be the only erections within miles of anywhere. Some time is now occupied in the operation known as shunting.
We're now at Ladmanlow, 8 miles from Whaley Bridge, alongside the busy Buxton to Leek Road. It was a principal station on the High Peak line with an extensive goods yard, a locomotive shed until 1892, and a water supply tank. There was also a goods shed in the yard. Passengers that were being carried when there was a passenger service over the line would leave the train here to get down into Buxton. All that remains today is this retaining wall, which was part of the loading dock. The line crossed the main road on a level crossing. About 100 yards from the crossing, there was a branch went off round here to Grin Quarry, which was a large quarry, large enough to have its own locomotive. Grin quarries were opened by Buxton Lime Firms in 1856, and they closed in 1954 around the same time as Ladmanlow Yard was closed. A few yards south of Grin Branch Junction, we're looking along the formation of the track, which shows the way in which the engineer maintained level sections between his inclined planes.
From Ladmanlow, the line carried forward to Old Harper and Harper Hill. Reaching Harper Hill Junction, the track diverged from the original High Peak alignment. It descended on a gradient of 1 in 41 to join, at Hindlow Junction, the new line from Buxton via Hindlow to Dowlow. Here the tracks met up with those of the original Cromford and High Peak alignment.
The line ran from Ladmanlow along past the reservoir below us, round behind these trees here, onto the embankment on a sharp curve, through the complex of buildings towards Old Harper and Harper Hill, round the bluff to Harper Hill Junction and Hindlow.
Hindlow is the next stopping place. Low in the Peak District means high, and the quaint old Derbyshire people describe a residence in these exposed altitudes as living out of doors. And nowadays you can get up to Hindlow through Buxton, of course, and not one incline on the way.
In order to serve the sidings between Harper Hill and Ladmanlow, a spur was built from Hindlow Junction up to Harper Hill, and that regained the alignment of the old Cromford and High Peak Railway.
On the site of Hindlow Station, Allen describes the alignment of the original Cromford and High Peak from Harper Hill to Hindlow.
From Harper Hill Junction, the line followed the 1260-foot contour away off behind these hills here, across and behind the lime works, and in fact ran at right angles over the tunnel, then swung round behind the hill there, past Bryler Grange and off towards Herdlow Top.
Before moving on southwards, Allen met Michael Bentley at Harper Hill Junction, an ex-footplateman from the Buxton shed.
The two jobs in the morning from Buxton were the 7:30 through to Briggs and the 7:40 Hindlow. When I first started firing, both jobs were worked by Derby 3 freights. And as the 3s wore out and were scrapped, the 4 freights came in, and then latterly we had Ivat Class 2s, which were the only light engine available to go around this area here, and the Stanier 8s, which worked the Hindlow and did the banking up as far as here. And quite often the 7:30 Briggs, even with a banking engine from Buxton, could take up to an hour to get to the top of the gradient at what we call the London Road Bridge, where the main Buxton-Ashbourne Road crosses the railway. The piece of track you see over there, known as Burlow, it was a dip which gave us another run at the 1 in 60 past Hindlow signal box and through Hindlow Tunnel up to Briggs. Having got to Briggs, and that could be quite a lengthy job, you did your shunting. If the train was small for up here, it would come up just with a single loco, the 730 engine. If it was a large train, the 740 would bank as far as this point here. Now, going down the hill could be equally as hair-raising. The method of operation was to hold the train back as slowly as possible till you got to the bridge down there, which is now, you can see the bridge has been removed and there's a gap. Now, bearing in mind you've got brakes pinned down, you'd then got to get it through the dip and up the 1 in 60 to Hindlow. So at that point at the bridge, you let the brake off and you went through the bottom at quite a rate of knots.
Over the years, numerous specials tackled the 1 in 60 climb out of Buxton, this one in 1967 en route to Harper Hill Junction. Up the 1 in 41, the Class 4 was supported by a Class 8. Once at the junction, the Class 4 cleared the points to move forward a short distance up the original High Peak alignment towards Hillhead Quarry, before reversing to the junction ready for the return down the gradient to Hindlow. Today, Hindlow still echoes to freight workings via Buxton.
Up until the late 60s, early 70s, by far the majority of traffic out of here was by rail. We were supplying burnt lime from the kiln plant you can see immediately behind us, that's now closed, up to British Steel and also our own magnesia seawater plant. That unfortunately is now gone, and we are left with the remnants of a rail dispatch system which is supplying the Scottish glass industry. However, we do see the actual rail side here expanding as the pressure to move materials by rail rather than road increases. Similarly, we expect as the reserves in the south of the country start to disappear, as they are doing at an alarming rate, it will become economic for us to take stone from here to the southern counties. So, all in all, we see the rail coming back to Dowlow, and it's been here basically nearly 100 years. The original Cromford High Peak line actually ran through the point where the quarry now exists, and I understand it was realigned just before the actual quarry opened.
From Dowlow, on the original High Peak alignment, the track descended Herdlow Incline. In 1869, the incline was closed and a deviation on a less demanding gradient was built by the London and North Western Railway Company. By 1894, the London and North Western had introduced a passenger train service from Buxton to Parsley Hay, with stations at Higher Buxton, Hindlow, Herdlow and Parsley Hay. Between Herdlow and Parsley Hay, a number of sharp curves were eliminated from the original Cromford and High Peak in readiness once the extension to Ashbourne had been built for the running of express passenger services to London. These commenced in 1899, the main line swinging away south of Parsley Hay, leaving the High Peak to continue en route to Fryden. This was a relatively level section which extended beyond Fryden right across the limestone plateau to the top of Hopton Incline, a distance of some 10 miles before the final descents to the Derwent Valley. We meet up with Alan in Green Lane, just south of Dowlow.
The new line from Buxton climbed all the way to Dowlow, and we're now at the summit. The quarry workings have obliterated the railway line in the same way as they have obliterated the alignment of the original line, which runs about 150 yards further up the hill to the right. When we were north of Burbage Tunnel, we found sleeper blocks there made of millstone grit. Here, just north of Herdlow Top, we find sleeper blocks made of limestone. And this one appears to be in its original position. The seat for the rail is here, and the hole for the pin, which secured it to the rail, is there. We're at the top of Herdlow Incline here. This is the first point where we leave the summit level and start to go down on various inclines until we reach Cromford. This incline was on a gradient of 1 in 16 with a length of 850 yards, taking it down into the valley below. In 1869 it was abandoned when a new line, which ran along in the valley across there, was opened, and this new line then meant that locomotive working could be operated throughout between Bunsell Top and Hopton Top. It's a reasonable supposition that this hollow is the site of the Herdlow Top engine house. The incline is over here behind me. The Herdlow engine was a 10 horsepower engine. Herdlow Incline was a shallower incline than some of the others, and therefore less power was needed to work it.
Herdlow is the succeeding station. Low again. A change of guard and transfer to a third engine with driver and fireman who can hold their own in grease and dirt with their ebony colleagues.
This bridge is above the site of Herdlow Station, which was down below us here. Just beyond the station was where the new line and the old track bed came together. The site of the former incline, Herdlow Incline, goes off up the hill, following the line of those electricity poles.
The High Peak opened in 2 stages. The southern section from Cromford to the bottom of Herdlow Incline in 1830, the remaining 17.5 miles to Whaley Bridge 1 year later.
More truck terrace. And then we bump along again, now upon a terrace of rocky embankment. now in a steep cutting, with the naked limestone rocks clothed in flounces of green, which you can gather as you pass, so scanty is the clearing. Anon we rush under a little bridge that seems to lead nowhere. Then we pause a little at a one-horse kind of station called Parsley Hay, which looks just like a wayside shed on an American prairie line.
Parsley Hay was the original station for Hartington, some 3 miles away. When the missing link down to Ashbourne was opened in 1899, Hartington had its own station, leaving Parsley Hay in the middle of nowhere, welcoming even fewer passengers than before. Following the Second World War, the Cromford and High Peak became a firm favourite with railway enthusiasts. Parsley Hay became an all-change station, welcoming specials, hauled on this occasion by a B1 in August 1964. For the ride over the High Peak, the enthusiasts transferred to less comfortable accommodation, often riding in open wagons to take in all the line had to offer, including sometimes its adverse weather. The Cromford and High Peak continued south-eastwards through Newhaven Tunnel towards Fryden, the main line soon beginning its long descent to Ashbourne en route southward.
Here we are in a deep cutting at Newhaven Tunnel. This carries the Buxton to Ashbourne Road across the line. It's 51 yards long. The plaque on the face of the tunnel records Jessop's name, the arms of the company and the date, and the Latin inscription Divina Palladis Arte, which translates as by the divine art of Pallas, the goddess of industry and science. We're now at Fryden, at the loading dock, and in the background can be seen the works of the Firebrick Company, which was served by the railway. From Fryden southwards, because of the way Jessop built the line, with the level sections for horse-drawn traffic, this meant there were numerous sharp curves, and in later years this also meant that bogie vehicles were prohibited south of Fryden, and it was necessary to employ short wheelbase locomotives for the same reason. Larger locomotives could be used between Fryden and Buxton, and Fryden became an interchange point for traffic to and from the High Peak line.
This section takes us to the brink of the Derwent Valley before the final steep descent to Cromford. It includes Gotham Curve, the impressive stone-faced embankments at Minninglow, the once busy Longcliffe Station, and the famous Hopton Incline. Within a mile of leaving Fryden, the line crossed the Newhaven to Cromford Road. Along with that at Ladmanlow, the Newhaven crossing was the only other location where road traffic had to give way. Numerous minor roads and tracks were bisected by the line, but the main road crossings at Ladmanlow and Newhaven were the only ones where formal arrangements were essential.
When we were at Fryden, we talked about there being a number of sharp curves between there and Hopton Top. There were in fact 21 curves of 5 chains or less, and the sharpest of them all is here at Gotham, and it sweeps round behind the trees and across the embankment over there, turning the line through very nearly 90 degrees.
I have heard it said that the driver and the guard can shake hands when you've got a long train in Gotham Curve, but it isn't quite as tight as that. We once brought some sturgeon wagons, rail wagons they were relaying down the peak. And when we picked them up at Fryden from the Buxton engine, my driver said, "We're going to have trouble with these, you know, Edward, round Gotham." I said, "Do you think so?" He said, "We'll have to keep the couplings tight all the way around." Well, we slowed as we approached Gotham and got the couplings tight. We told the guard to put his brake on in the brake van. But the buffers, they're locked. And the couplings were that tight and the buffers were locked. There was no way we could, without drawing the buffers off. And I had to hack the floor of the wagon through with the coal pick to release the buffers from underneath.
Here's another of the sharp curves at the south end of Minninglow Embankment. These embankments were quite a feature of the line, having stone facing on both sides.
Whilst the track bed and the engineering works that were required to build it can still be seen over much of the route, any reminders that the High Peak was once a working railway have largely disappeared.
This is one of the medium-sized quarries that was served by the railway. Where I'm standing is the top of the loading area, and down below we can see sleepers and in the distance even some rails. There's the remains of a hand crane standing in the yard where it's been rusting away for many years. This is the siding on which empty wagons would have stood for loading. Up above us we see the rails that were the end of the internal system in the quarry, which appears to have been of 2-foot gauge, and on which hand-operated skips would have been used to bring the limestone for tipping into the wagons below. This quarry would also be one of those that was served by the railway with a supply of water from the springs at Cromford.
The scenery has not been specially attractive the last few miles. Rather a monotonous tableland where niggard fields and stubborn heath are ruled off with bleak stone walls, and the perspective is unbroken, save here and there by a clump of storm-rent pines. I think by this time the discomfort induced by a High Peak bone shaker was beginning to take its toll. I was certainly pleased to see some signs of human habitation. At Longcliffe, we get into a pleasant country of hill and dale, with glimpses of wood and water.
We've now reached Longcliffe Station. This was one of the major stations on the line, and the station house over here dates back to the early days. Until recently, there were traces in the end wall of the doors into the stables when horses pulled the wagons along the railway. Behind me is the old goods shed, and also alongside that there used to be a line that ran to coal wharves and down to one of the local quarries.
Close by, another building survives.
The train used to come along on the sidings, back in along here, delivering coal. We've got quite a lot of coal in the garden that we seem to have dug up as we've gone along. And here, where the gate is, used to be the weighbridge, where the lorries would bring in things to be delivered onto the trains.
Longcliffe was a watering point for locomotives, and over here we see the ramp up which the tanks were run to stand against the buffer stop so that the water could be run by gravity into the locomotive. Longcliffe was also the originating point for a daily milk train which ran to Buxton and points beyond.
While summers could be very pleasant, winters on the High Peak were often hard. Jeff Buckley's father worked this section of the line for many years.
I think perhaps one of the most poignant things I ever saw on all my dad's photographs was the way he husbanded his wooden doors for the engines. I think one has to realise just how cold a winter the Cromford and High Peak could suffer from. And at all times, whenever I saw my father, it was either alongside a door, carrying a door, but whatever it was, he was there with his doors to ensure that he got some protection from the dreadful cold and wind on the high peak.
Heavy snowfalls created exceptional problems. 1947 and 1963 were particularly bad winters when the line was frequently blocked.
In 1947, the Italian prisoners of war were cutting these cuttings out in 3 lifts, throwing it up to one another. On this occasion, George Pearce said he weren't stopping in the break. He got down and always walked with his hands in his pocket and his head down. He went inside a jug and glass at Longcliffe and had 3 or 4 whiskies. He come out and fell and got up and walked again, but he got up wrong road about and he walked back to where he left, at Pryden. His idea was to walk to Middleton Top and go home. But with snowing that heavy, he didn't realise he walked the wrong way. Terrible blizzards in them days.
As Hopton is approached, there is some bold rock scenery, and the limestone cuttings show engineering works of great difficulty. Another engine is harnessed to ours here, and with both brakes screwed down, we slide down the incline to Middleton.
When the line opened, Hopton Incline was worked by a stationary engine, and like the other inclines, it was double track. In 1877, due to its boilers becoming worn out, the stationary engine went out of use. By this time it had been found that crew goods tender locomotives, rebuilt with side tanks, were able to climb the 1 in 14 gradient with 2 or 3 wagons. The downhill line was used, the uphill being abandoned.
We're now at the top of Hopton Incline on our journey south. This is the second incline taking us down into the Derwent Valley. It was eased from the bottom by making the gradients successively 1 in 60, 1 in 30, 1 in 20, with the final 200 yards at 1 in 14. It was still a very difficult gradient to work, and locomotives were limited to 3 loaded wagons or 7 empty wagons. And in poor rail conditions, when it was damp, they would very often slip to a stand and have to reverse to the bottom, divide the train and bring it up in 2 parts.
The 450-yard incline with its 1 in 14 section was the steepest incline routinely worked by locomotives in the British Isles. The successful climbing of Hopton required special skills only developed over many years by the drivers of the high peak.
Road knowledge is not only of the road, but of the using of the engines over that road. The answer was always up Hopton Bank. A good run at it, a good head of steam blowing off, and half a boiler of water.
In the 1950s, the future looked bright for the high peak, with an anticipated increase in traffic from the Intake, Hopton Wood and Middleton quarries, down Middleton and Sheep Pasture inclines to Cromford and via Parsley Hay. A shortage of wagons created problems. A British Railways report acknowledged that if traffic increases further, it will not be possible to satisfactorily deal with it.
We're now at the bottom of the Hopton Incline. The factory behind me was planned in the late 50s, and the promised tonnage to the railway was something in excess of 100,000 tonnes per annum.
The magnesium electron factory opened in March 1963 to produce magnesium from dolomite.
It was in October 1937 that a train from Middleton, approaching the bottom of Hopton and running at high speed to gain sufficient impetus to reach the top, began to nose from side to side and became derailed. The locomotive plunged down the embankment into the road here, bringing its wagons with it, and unfortunately the driver, Bowden, was killed and his fireman injured.
Just south of Hopton Incline, a cutting and a tunnel of 113 yards was needed to maintain a level formation as far as Middleton Top. Middleton Top is around 1,000 feet above sea level and some 250 feet below the summit level of the line. Middleton Incline was the first of two further inclines that dropped the line 718 feet down to the canal at Cromford. This section includes the engine house at Middleton Top, Middleton Incline, and the level section of the track that served Middle Peak Sidings and Steeplehouse Goodyard, Middleton Quarry, reached by the Killers Branch, and the quarries close by Black Rocks, before it reached the top of the final incline at Sheep Pasture.
Middleton Incline was the first of the two inclines which will take us down to the canal. And behind me you see the engine house which housed the winding engine. The engine house being built in the 1820s, the fires of which were fed with wood offcuts sent from the carriage and wagon works in Derby.
Now we know this engine commenced its working life about 1829, and it worked right through to 1963, so it had a long working life. Restoration of the engine commenced in the early 70s, so it hadn't been closed very long, and the early restoration was actually started by the industrial section of the Derbyshire Archaeological Society. So it's thanks to their early efforts that the engine is here, and we still work on the engine on quite a regular basis, most Monday nights, and it's open to the public and running on the first weekend of each month between April and October.
This cable has been lying here for 30 odd years disused, and was the method by which the wagons were moved up and down the incline. When in operation, the incline was worked on a balance system whereby loads coming up were balanced by wagons going down. The maximum weight of a run of wagons was laid down as 38 tonnes, and the speed at which they were allowed to run was no more than 8 miles per hour, which meant that for the Middleton incline, a run would take about 4 minutes.
The wagons, of course, had to be fastened onto the wire rope, and the gentlemen that attached the wagons to the rope were officially known as hangers-on. The chains for fastening the wagons onto the ropes used to come underneath the first axle, over the second, and then they used to fasten onto the rear drawbar of the wagon. So he was ducking under wagons all the time. And of course this had to be done at both top and the bottom of the incline. And the driver, of course, would not be able to start the engine, or start a run as they call it, until both men had completed their task.
One of the intriguing features is this short length of leather thong with a buckle on the end, and 2 of these were needed for every run on the incline, because the method of attaching the wagons was to put a chain under the lower coupling of the wagon, pass it under the wagon, and then that chain became 2 of diminishing link sizes and was plaited over and over the cable, finishing up with 2 of these leather thongs, which then, merely by friction, secured the wagon to the cable for its safe haulage up and down.
It was a real hive of industry. Someone had got a job to do and was doing that job all the time. At the top of the incline, there was ropes jangling and fastening the wagons that were going down the incline, and then there were the engine then working at the other end, marshalling the traffic. It was never still, all day long, but it was just a day railway that started at 6 o'clock in the morning and finished towards 4, 5 and 6 o'clock at night.
The Middleton incline had a length of 708 yards on a gradient of 1 8 1/4. It was an impressive drop.
The locomotive leaves us, and down below us drops the shining tracks of steel, its diminishing lines a study in perspective. I confess, a little foolhardy. Middleton had a reputation for runaways. People had been killed, and I knew it. Ride across the buffers and jump off if anything gives way, I was told.
We've seen the engine house at Middleton Top with the engine which provided the power to move the rope. Here at the bottom of Middleton we see the pit in which the wheel was situated, round which the rope ran between the two tracks. This wheel was arranged so that it could be slid along in the line of the tracks to make adjustments to the tension of the rope, both when new ropes were fitted and of course between the hot weather and the cold weather, when that length of rope would expand and contract quite considerably. Ahead of us is a level stretch which takes us through to Sheep Pasture Incline and the final drop to Cromford Canal. On this side is the town of Wirksworth, and Wirksworth was served by a goods yard at Middle Peak Siding, which ran away in this direction over here. Just ahead of us was the siding at the bottom of the incline, which was used for storage of wagons in transit. We're now at Steeple House, having moved on from Middleton Bottom. This is the station house just here. Just along from Station House was a stable block which was used for the horses when the line was first built and before locomotives were in use. Opposite that was the junction with the Killers branch, which served a quarry in Middleton. This was built in 1887 and was interesting in as much it was quite a steeply graded branch at 1 in 30.
Well, they had various runaways down Killer's branch, but they let them run out, didn't they? Didn't do no damage. It's just a bit of an air-raising job running out at the bottom and over that bridge at Steeple again. The weight of the limestone got top of, you see. They put so many brakes down coming out to Middleton Quarry, and then if you hadn't gone steady enough, they couldn't get them more and it'd push you down. And you'd be going too fast to be safe, really, but probably run as far as Black Rocks on there.
Today is occupied by a narrow gauge railway which operates at weekends for pleasure purposes and which is called the Steeple House Light Railway.
Picturesque enough to make me wish to enchant hither the painters by whom it would be most appreciated is the view now, with the black rocks pointing over the Matlock Valley, and then the filmy smoke of peaceful Wirksworth rising lazily from the green wooded hollow beyond. That sleepy hollow is Adam Bede's country.
This concluding section of the Cromford and High Peak takes us from Sheep Pasture Top down the 3/4 of a mile Sheep Pasture Incline with its catch pit for runaway wagons to the canal at the foot of the incline at Cromford. The track bed passes alongside the old High Peak workshops, coming in a short distance to the transshipment shed, from where the line ran to High Peak Junction between Cromford and Wat Standwell stations on the former Midland Main Line linking Derby and Manchester.
We're about half a mile from the Black Rocks Visitor Centre, just approaching the top of the Sheep Pasture Incline. To my right is the site of the engine house, and behind me over my shoulder is the reservoir which was the source of water for both the winding engine and the locomotive which worked between Sheep Pasture Top and Middleton Bottom. We're at the top of Sheep Pasture Incline, and the engine house here housed one of the original Butterley built engines, This one was interesting in as much as it was worn out by 1883 and had to be replaced by what was part of a locomotive. The crankshaft and the cylinders were used and were fed with steam from an ordinary locomotive boiler at a pressure of 80 pounds per square inch.
By the 1960s, the old London and North Western Ramsbottom locomotive boiler was wearing out. With prospects of continuing favourable traffic down the Killers branch from Middleton Quarry, and also the anticipated output from the factory being built at Hopton, it was decided to go electric with the installation of new winding gear at Sheep Pasture. A 100 horsepower motor was specified, allowing an out-of-balance load of 60 tonnes downwards or 10 tonnes upwards. This was brought into operation in 1965.
I remember my father running Sheep Pasture engine, and as a young man, young teenager, I visited him there, and I remember to this day the smell of the engine, sort of a mixture of hot oil and steam. As a young man, something like that was quite exciting. The steam leaks and the general. The fact that it was quite silent, relatively silent compared to its size, and my father being my hero because he was controlling this vast machine.
When the Sheep Pasture incline was constructed, there would have been a considerable amount of work by the engineers making this cutting, which would obviously have been necessary to get a uniform gradient.
There is another of those creepy, dithery inclines at Sheep Pasture on the curve of 1 in 8 to Cromford. But one forgets the risk of riding on the buffers, for the rocky cutting through which the line winds is a fern paradise that is a revelation in loveliness. Lovely, but dangerous. There have been 2 major runaways since I went down in 80. One of them involving a brake van loaded with gunpowder. A canister exploded at the bottom and sent fragments of the van far and wide. Never again.
The incline was built originally as 2 separate inclines with an intermediate winding engine. The top incline was on a gradient of 1 in 8, the lower on a gradient of 1 in 9. They were combined into one incline in 1857. The total combined length then being 1,320 yards.
We've now moved away from the limestone area round Middleton, and we've got into gritstone. Here alongside the Sheep Pasture incline we find a small quarry where this material was cut, and in the middle of this quarry is this rather large crane which must have been used when the quarry was in operation. We're now near the bottom of the Sheep Pasture incline, and in the background you can hear traffic on the busy A6 road. When the 2 inclines were combined into one in the 1850s, we had an incline which had a total length of 3/4 of a mile, and any wagon which ran away on that incline could achieve a considerable speed by the time it reached the bottom at Cromford Yard. They were quite capable of careering through the yard, leaping over the canal and over the Midland Railway line beyond it, and being smashed to pieces in the fields beyond, according to contemporary reports in the railway press of the time. To avoid this problem, this catch pit was constructed in the 1880s. The operation was such that any wagons on the upside going up the hill were dealt with simply by catch points which closed behind the wagons as they passed, and therefore anything breaking away and running down went straight into the catch pit. However, downcoming wagons had to be directed round the catch pit if they were under control. And to do this, the wheels of the wagons operated a treadle some distance above the catch pit, that treadle ringing a gong. The pointsman could judge by the period between successive rings of the gong whether the wagon was moving at a normal speed, and if so, he would pull the points across so that the wagons came round the catch pit. If, however, the gong rang in quick succession, then he would be satisfied that the wagon was running away, and he would leave the points as they were set, and that would run the wagons straight into the catch pit. The last time this happened was in September 1965, when 2 wagons ran away, and the remains of those wagons are still in the catch pit today. We're now at the bottom of Sheep Pasture Incline, and this is the remains of the signalling arrangement between the top and the bottom. A very simple arrangement with a pointer on a drum here, which was capable of being moved round to 3 positions. This drum was linked by wires to a similar drum in the engine house at the top. The pointer pointing upwards to B meant stand by. Another position was G for go, and the third position was S for stop. When the men at the bottom had arranged a run of wagons and attached them to the rope, then this pointer would be moved round to B, and that would move the pointer in the engine house to the same position, and at the same time a bell would ring in the engine house to alert the engineman that the pointer had moved. When everything was ready at both top and bottom, then the pointer would be moved at the top to go, and that would correspondingly move this one here and alert the men here that the wagons would be moving in a few moments.
Again, the reverse procedure for actually stopping the engine. The first one to stop, the engineman would obviously stop, because it's not unknown for the wagons to actually slide down the rope a little bit. So quite often the signal to stop would come from the bottom of the incline before the wagons had actually arrived over the summit at the top. So they would have to stop part way around and then bring them up again the last little bit.
At the foot of Sheep Pasture stands this tank. It acted as a water reservoir being supplied from a spring on the hillside. From it, the water was carried in converted London and North Western tenders for locomotive, quarry and domestic purposes as far away as Hartington and Herdlow. On the inclines they provided a useful balancing load for the descending stone traffic, as did the wagons of coal for locomotive and domestic purposes and wagons of wood used to fire the boilers of the stationary engines.
Here, a few yards from the bottom of the incline, is the area in which wagons would have been marshalled ready for going up the incline or being taken away down to High Peak Junction for conveyance elsewhere on the main railway network. The buildings behind me are the original buildings that were built in the 1820s when the line was constructed, and they include the workshop and also various offices. Beyond these again was a small locomotive shed which was used for the locomotive which worked this section from the incline down to High Peak Junction.
We've got to imagine that the buildings here were of vibrant workshops. It would have been alive with people working here, from carpenters through to blacksmiths through to engineers, making and putting together the things that they needed for the railway. The tools that they used, very, very primitive. This is one stamped Cromford and High Peak Railway, C&HPR Co., which is a prototype Stilson. An adjustable spanner actually worked by nothing more than a wedge which enables you to move the jaws and to lock them into position. We've also got to imagine that the conditions that they worked in were very cold, very gloomy. Even in 1967, when the railway closed, these buildings had no electricity inside them. Everything was lit by oil lamp.
At long last, we arrive at Cromford. It's good for stone, the Cromford and High Peak, not people. If you need to travel south, the Midland line through Bakewell and Matlock is really the only way to go. And next year, just in time for the 20th century, you will be able to sample the new London and North Western service from Buxton through to Ashbourne over the new line from Parsley Hay. No inclines, and on gradients that cannot be detected. Or so I am assured. Another locomotive to take the train to High Peak Junction? No, thank you very much. I will not ride down to the junction. My bones have been sufficiently dissected, and the greyhound at Cromford is eloquent of a refreshing bath and of a well-cooked dish of plump trout that were rising at flies in the cool Derwent an hour ago.
Here we are at the end of the original Cromford and High Peak line. That line was built for the purpose of linking the Peak Forest Canal and the Cromford Canal. We started off at the canal basin at Whaley Bridge, and here we are 33 miles on alongside the transshipment shed at Cromford. In the early years this would have been a hive of activity, but this would have been diminished to some extent in 1853 when the link was made to the railway at High Peak Junction.
The 3/4 of a mile link to High Peak Junction ran on a shelf above the River Derwent.
The train that we've seen has just passed High Peak Junction. This was the point at which the High Peak Railway lost its isolation by connection to what was then the Manchester, Buxton, Matlock and Midlands Junction Railway in 1853.
It was the main line crews and engines that had to fetch all the traffic that was taken down the incline. All the traffic that came down the inclines to Cromford was brought down to High Peak Junction, where they put it in one or two particular roads that the mainline crews had to fetch them out and marshal their train ready for taking it to Chadderton.
In the early 1960s, the fortunes of the High Peak began to wane as quarries closed and road transport took over the staple traffic of the line. In 1962, Hopton Wood Quarry, served by a branch just north of Hopton Tunnel, closed, leaving as the main source of traffic on the Middleton Top to Fryden section that from the Prestwich Intake Quarry close by Middleton Top. The following year, the Middleton Top engine hauled its final loads over the incline. Its closure was due to the poor condition of its boiler, by this time an ancient part of a Ramsbottom 060. Replacement was considered not to be economic, bearing in mind the level of traffic over the incline. Traffic from the intake quarry fluctuated considerably, and by 1966 the section above Middleton was worked only on 3 days a week, sometimes a booking only amounting to 1 or 2 water tanks and a guards van, revenue-earning wagons of limestone conspicuous by their absence. At this time, water was being brought to Middleton from Buxton. The line from High Peak Junction up Sheep Pasture to Steeple House and the Killers Branch to Middleton Quarry remained open for traffic. By 1967, this too came to an end, it being found more economic to transfer the traffic to road vehicles from Conveyance to Wirksworth. Here it was loaded into 25-ton hopper wagons, which couldn't be used over the Sheep Pasture incline, and then away over the former Midland Branch to Duffield on the line linking Derby and Sheffield, a practice which was only started during the time Sheep Pasture was going electric. The bright future for the route northwards from Hopton, heralded by the opening of the rail-connected magnesium electron factory in 1963, all faded away when the works failed to meet anticipated production levels. 1967 brought the closure of the line all the way from Middleton Top to Dowlow. The line from Ladman to Hindlow Junction closed to traffic in stages from 1954, that from Harper Hill to Hindlow Junction in 1973. The sun had certainly set over the Cromford and High Peak.
Before the railway closed in 1967, Derbyshire County Council and the Peak Park Planning Board had entered into negotiations about turning 17.5 miles of the old track bed between Cromford and Dowlow into one of the first countryside trails sponsored by the Countryside Commission. To enable visitors to enjoy their stay with us more, we provide 3 visitor centres. We've got one at High Peak Junction where the trail meets the canal, one at Black Rocks and one at Middleton Top here. There are car parks, there's toilets, inside there's information that people can use, there's refreshments available and there's souvenirs that they can buy.
At Middleton Top and Parsley Hay, cycle hire centres provide facilities for all members of the family. On the northern section of the High Peak in the beautiful Goyt Valley, much of the track bed can be followed, both alongside the Fernley Reservoir and from the top of Bunsell over the moor to Burbage Tunnel. At Whaley Bridge, a linear walkway has been established from the canal basin up the Whaley Bridge incline on to Horwich End and through to Shallcross. And so the Cromford and High Peak lives on as a recreational route for all to enjoy today and for generations to come. In the memories of enthusiasts, past employees and their families, the High Peak will always be remembered. A railway that was different, and one that was exceptional in so many ways.
I've managed to retain 1 or 2 artefacts. This is one of those, the train stuff for High Peak Junction to Cromford. And this gave authority to the driver of the locomotive to work between those points.
This came from the floor of the original Middleton Top locomotive shed. That was demolished with the establishing of a visitor and cycle hire centre at the summit.
I run the cycle centre for Derbyshire County Council on the High Peak Trail, continuing a family tradition of working on the railway. I believe that my family helped to build the railway way back in 1825 or thereabouts, and they looked after the horses when the horses were used to pull the wagons between the inclines. I think the family worked on the railway right till its closure.
When one thinks that complete families spent a complete working lifetime within 14 miles, and some would work at Cromford Bottom or Sheep Pasture Top, Middleton Bottom, and they would spend 50 of their working lives in that area. When one thinks of the rest of the main line, drivers doing hundreds of miles a day, and these men would remain within that community for 50 years.
I enjoyed every minute of my time on the High Peak Railway. Yeah, it was nice to be paid for something that you enjoyed doing.